right, everybody.
Hello.
Let me cut my volume down a little bit. How's that better? Yeah, that's a little bit better. Is it still too hot, Joshua? All right. Well, we'll just give it a couple minutes. I started a little bit earlier, but it jumped online real quick. I just want to let everybody get a chance to tune in. Everybody doing okay?
That's where y'all were last week.
Where were all y'all last week?
I was there.
Okay.
16, we had 16.
16?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
That might have been 14, I can't count that good.
Okay.
I doubt that. I can get a lot of people by myself.
All right, well, if you would open your Bibles to Acts chapter 27. We are so close to the end of Acts, which means I arrive at the most difficult part of my job, figuring out the next book. See, once I make that decision, it's smooth sailing. Once, I just go to the next verse, next chapter, but picking that next book, I guess it should be getting easier since there's only 66 books, and I think I've taught through, I don't know, we've probably done 12 to 15. I'd have to look back and see what we've done so far, whether it be in here or on Sunday morning. But anyway, let me open us in a word of prayer, and we're going to dive right in here, okay? Father, we thank you for another day of your grace. Thank you for my time away with family and keeping everything stable back at home and here at the church, and just the blessing of being back. I wish I could say that I was rested, but that is usually not what happens on vacation. But I am glad to be back and be safe and to be welcomed here by these folks that I love very, very much, and to have another opportunity to open your word and to see what you have to say to us, what you have to teach us, how you want to guide us and direct us, and then where we can share our heart with you, and you can mold us and shape us through prayer as we begin to understand and seek out your will in our lives and in the lives of those around us. And so we pray that you'll bless this time, and we ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so I don't remember what Paul was in last week. No matter, because I'm not. Because he was in Hebrews, okay. Because we're going to pick up, but I want to remind you where we were. Paul, for 2 years, has been in Roman custody under Festus and Felix, and he has been held without a formal charge. All right. Now the Jews had their accusations, but there was no formal charge that was given, and that was the last thing we saw at the end of chapter 27. At the end of 26, is that Felix or Festus, whichever one it was seeking to understand, well, what do I send in this letter to tell Nero that this guy is charged with, so Nero can make a judgment against him. So for 2 long years, Paul has gone through 2 different governors. He's avoided a couple different assassination attempts by the Jews in Jerusalem. And he has ultimately pleaded, has expressed his desire to plead his case before Caesar. And in this case, the Caesar would be Nero. And that's what's going to happen. But in order for that to happen, Paul's got to go to Rome. Because Nero's not going to come to him. He's not like a Felix or a Festus. He's going to stay right where he is. And so he's got a journey that he's got to take from Caesarea, and I'll show you where that is in just a moment, over to I was getting ready to say Jerusalem, but no, that's not right. Over to Rome. Under normal circumstances, that would be a 2 to 3 week journey. I just want you to keep that into perspective, because what would be a 2 to 3 week journey, I believe, as we go through chapter 27, 28, we're going to realize is going to take him about 7 months to get there. That's quite a long layover. All right, it's quite a long layover, and so this is going to be an interesting journey. And we might wonder, this whole chapter, we don't have time to read it and then for me to go back through it, so we're just going to read it bit by bit. But if I had the chance to read it, you might just ask yourself, why did Luke record this to us? This is a detailed account of a voyage where they encounter a hurricane or a tempest and are shipwrecked. And you might ask, why in the world does he include this? Well, I'm going to show you a place in the text where I believe is the reason why he includes this in such detail. But we're going to flesh it out. And I've read a lot of different commentators and stuff. And a lot of people just want to take this whole thing and allegorize it. You know what I mean by that? Like, just take this and say, this is what this really means, make an allegory out of it. And you don't need me to help you with that, because it does not take a literal storm and your ability to allegorize that to the storms of life you don't need me to do that. But we can flesh that out a little bit. But I just want us to see what Luke says, because for Luke, who was on this journey and experienced this whole thing, this was obviously very, very important to him. It was a monumental moment in his life, I believe. Okay? So let's see what he has to say. We'll start with verse number 1. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So Paul's headed to Rome, and he has an escort who is a centurion. This means this guy is a commander of 100 soldiers. Now, I don't know, and I've read through this whole thing, I don't know if he's got his 100 soldiers with him. I kind of doubt that. It might be hard to get on a standby on a boat when you've got 100 soldiers with him. But nonetheless, this is a guy of some level of importance because we know he commands 100 men. And Luke also gives us a very, very specific detail. I don't want to say that it's important because I don't think it has any theological ramifications for us, but he tells us that he's a centurion of the Augustan regiment. Now, does anybody have any idea what that means? Augustus was who? Augustus Caesar. Now, he's dead. I'm not sure how long ago it was, but he's dead. But apparently, I mean, just think of it this way. There's several different options you have here. There's some historical documents written by Tacitus and Josephus where they refer to this regiment and what it was, but it's not really super clear. But this is what I gather from this. In order for a regiment of men or soldiers to be classified by the name Augustus, these aren't your second-hand soldiers. These are like the Navy SEALs. These guys are going to be top-notch. And so would their commander, or their centurion in this case. And so, and I personally think that in this long voyage, that Luke probably had an opportunity to get to know Julius. All right? And all the Juliuses I know are stand-up guys. So, I have no doubt that this guy would be too. And I think maybe he assumes that one day this Julius might read this, and he would want him to recognize that he knew who he was, and he knew what a valuable soldier, and maybe even an honorable soldier he was, that he had some sort of clout. And so Luke seems to want to flaunt this, that he knew who this guy was, that this guy was a man of certain ranking, okay? Let's see what he says next. All right, so entering the ship of Andromedium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, that's a guy, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. When we had put to sea from there, we sailed from under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. Therefore the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. Okay, so now, Joshua, you got to hit the button so I can see. Hit the button, and then it's capital G-R, the number 8, and smiles. Now the whole world knows the password. So, all right, so here we go. Sometimes to pass through all those names, let's just figure out kind of where we are. All right, so I have my pointer. So Cindy, if you're looking for the handle to the broom, and if I forget to put it back, here it is. All right, so down here, this little spot right here, this is the Dead Sea. So this is where Jerusalem is, all right? And Caesarea is just north of Jerusalem, and that's where Felix and Festus were governor, and they had the trials and stuff like that. And so the first thing that he did was they boarded this ship that was, where was this ship from, did he say? See if anybody else can pronounce that word.
Oh, no.
Andromedium. All right. So Andromedium is way up here. All right. And so this ship, since it was from Andromedium, is probably headed back to Andromedium. But guess what? This isn't going to be a one-stop. This isn't going to be a direct flight. He's not going to be able to get on one ship and ultimately make it there. Because obviously, if he's trying to go all the way over here to the boot of Italy, which is way over there past that little red line, he's not going to go up there because that's not how you get there. But nonetheless, they found a ship going to Andromedium, And that's going to at least get them going in the right direction. And so what he said is that what their target was to go along the landmass and to kind of be underneath here. I mean, the reason they did that, and I have to confess to you, I don't know a lot about sailing. I do not know a lot about sailing. The only time I've ever been in a dinghy was a disaster. That was on our honeymoon. Charity probably remembers that. Thankfully, they didn't have iPhones to take pictures of the debacle back then. But if you have a nor'easter, which is the bad wind, this is where you'd want to be, because the landmass would protect you, all right, from that. So that's their goal here, is they want to scoot along up here. And you saw that he mentioned Sidon, and then it said that they went over there, and they were under the cover of Cyprus. And so they were using these land masses to kind of put them in an area where they would be protected from the wind, because apparently maybe hurricane season's coming up. We're going to see that in a moment. And so I think in this last paragraph that I read, they ended up ultimately at Myra, and they stopped right here. So they still got a long way to go, but they're here in Myra, and so far it's been uneventful. And he says, there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. So now, isn't it interesting that Rome did not have its own ship to transport this very, very influential and important figure? But apparently, what Rome could do as the reigning superpower and the one who ruled over this whole region was they could basically go up to a ship and say, hey, we're riding with you and this is where we're going. But Julius, being a good centurion, did not want to abuse that power, because I'm assuming with the letter from Nero, he could have very easily told this ship captain who was going to Andromedium, hey, no, you're going to Italy, but he didn't do that. So when he got here, they got off the boat, and they found a ship from Alexandria, which would have been over here from the Greece area, but this ship was going off to Italy, and so they hopped on that. Also notice how nice Julius was. When they got to Sidon, what did he let Paul do?
See his friends.
Yeah, it sounds like he got off the boat, because remember when he came back on his third missionary journey, he stopped there and spent several days with the people there, and he was encouraged. And so apparently it was probably those same people in Sidon that ministered to Paul, and he trusted him to come back to the boat. And so he comes back to the boat, and they continue on the journey, and here they are at Myra. Now let's see what happens next. Verse 7. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, I'm going to say that's right, I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmon, passing it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. So they leave Myra, and they go through this little area over here. This is Cnidus over here. So to get there, they would have passed through these little islands and stuff like that. And he ultimately went down here. And Fair Havens, we still know this, is on the south side of the island of Crete. And so he ends up down here. He's almost halfway to his final destination. You can't see Italy all the way over there, but he's about halfway there. And he's off the island of Crete in the middle of the Mediterranean. But from here to here, what happened? The weather started getting tough. Chinese, you remember that? Okay. So this 3-hour tour is getting ready to be a much longer thing, or this 2 to 3 week tour is getting ready to be much longer. So they barely make it to Fair Havens, which I've had numerous commentators and pastors mention that Fair Havens must have been named by the community board or something like that, because a fair haven it was not. Especially during the winter when Paul was going to be there, as we're going to see in a moment. This was not the place you ultimately wanted to be. But that's where he is now. Look at verse number 9. Now when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous, so not just slow, not just inconvenient, not just contrary to the winds, but now dangerous because the fast was already over. Now what Paul's talking about here is this would have been the fast that was associated with the Day of Atonement. All right, so Paul would have celebrated the Day of Atonement in this period of fasting on the boat. But they know when this is. And so depending on the year that it would have been the end of September, first couple of days of October. And in the Jewish mind, from the early part of March to the end of September or the early part of October, those were the ideal times to sail. Because when you get past October 5th, it's hurricane season. And it's not the place you want to be when you're on the Mediterranean. And so Paul knows, because the Day of Atonement is over and his fasting is over, which he would have observed on the boat, that this is not a good time to be on the water. All right? So let's see what he says. So Paul advised them. Isn't that interesting? He's a prisoner, one of several, headed to Nero for trial. And here he is, and somehow he has garnered the respect of Julius to where he's allowed to get off the boat and be ministered to. He's got companions. The guy from Macedonia is with him. Aristarchus, he's with him. Luke's with him. And they're not prisoners. Luke keeps saying we. He's there through this entire thing. And here Paul advises him. Now you might think to yourself, well, who is Paul to advise him? Well, look at what he says in Corinthians. I think it's either 1 or 2 Corinthians 11:25. I don't remember which one. But he points out the fact that up until this point, he's already been in 3 shipwrecks. He's already been in 3 shipwrecks. In one of them, he spent a day and a half on the water floating around on wreckage. So he was quite well versed in not doing things right, or being on boats where captains were not doing things right with regard to navigating the seas. So he's giving them advice. In verse number 10, he says, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives." Now, is he giving them a prophecy? Is he being prophetic here? I don't think so. I think that Luke would have been very blatant about it, because you'll see why as we get to the end of this chapter, when he is going to give a word from the Lord, from a messenger of the Lord or an angel. But here, I think Paul he knew the seas. He just spent 3 missionary journeys traveling in large part by boat, going to all these different places, and had been in the sea enough times and had been in bad weather enough times that he knew this was not a time you want to be on the water. But if it was a prophecy, it was a wrong one, as you'll see in a little bit, because no one's going to die on this at all. But that'll unfold as we get to the end. So I think this is just him giving them some wise counsel. All right? Number 11. Nevertheless, the centurion, Julius, was more persuaded by the helmsman. I guess that's the captain, or the guy who's at the helm of the boat, the guy who's steering. I'm assuming that's the captain, maybe not. And the owner of the ship. I don't know if the owner of the ship's on the boat, or if this was just the advice. It might have been the kind of thing where when they left Myra, he says, look, come hell or high water, you make sure you get this wheat where it's going. I don't care what it could have been, that sort of thing. I don't have any idea. But he's listening to all these different people, the helmsman, the owner of the ship, and the centurion was persuaded by them more so than the things spoken by Paul, according to verse number 11. Verse 12, and because the harbor, this is at Fair Havens, was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, which is right here. Big dot right there. Only 40 miles away. 40 miles away, and their mind was there was a harbor where things were configured where they could winter the storm, or winter this, or go through this. They could weather the winter. Okay, not necessarily a storm, but weather the winter and do it well. That was what the consensus said. And so verse 12, and because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So now here's my question to you. It might be the only one I ask you tonight. You're Paul. Or let's say you want to be the centurion. Or let's say you want to be the captain. Or whoever it is. Given all the things, all the information you're receiving, what do you do? What do you do? Joshua?
It's only 40 miles.
It's only 40 miles. What could possibly go wrong, right? It's only 40 miles. What do you do? I mean, this is kind of a situation. Please, I hope you don't. I hope that you're not, I hope me saying it this way doesn't offend you, but this is one of those you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. It's like, what do we do here? We can't stay in Fair Havens because this is not a place that we can winter. I don't know if it was an option to actually get off the boat and take to land and just hope that, I don't know how bad things would have gotten there. And this is a situation where you're listening to all these different people. You've got the owner of the boat who most certainly wants what to happen?
The boat to stay intact. He doesn't want anything to happen to his boat.
Get rid of y'all.
Yeah, I think most worldly pagan boat captains or boat owners, they're more concerned about the cargo getting to its destination so they can get paid. Now, I'm not saying he wouldn't have cared about the lives of his men, but he probably would have pushed hard and thought to himself, hey, these guys knew what they signed up for. They're sailors, Then you've got the captain or the helmsman, and he's trying to, earn his keep as the captain and get the crew there safely. Because, if they follow that age-old adage that, the captain goes down with the ship, he doesn't want them to die because he doesn't want to die either. And he's sitting there. You got this centurion who would seem has the power to make this ship either stay or go. It would seem that he has that authority from this story, because it says that the centurion was not persuaded by these other guys. So I think ultimately the authority that he has from Nero is what's going to dictate this thing, but he's listening to people. So at least he's seeking some wise counsel. So he's listening to the captain or the helmsman. He's listening to the owner. He's listening to Paul, to whom he has a lot of respect for. But what should he do? You don't have to allegorize this to understand that this would be a difficult decision to make. Paul seems to be some sort of prophet of God here, but he's not told me he's had a vision from the angel of the Lord or anything like that. He's just given me some wise counsel. I got the captain over here. This is what he does for a living. I've got all these, you'll find out later, there's 276 people on this boat. There's a lot going on here, a lot of lives at stake. And I think you'll find in your life, maybe not to this level of importance, but you'll find yourself in situations where you're like, I don't know what to do. I might know what I want to do. And, I don't want to stay in Fair Haven, but I also don't want to die. And I can see, why the helmsman, wouldn't want to stay here. And I can see why the centurion would want to do this. And Paul, he's saying, we shouldn't stay here, but I'm not sure where to go. And who knows, he might not want to stay here just because he doesn't want to make it to Italy to stand before Nero, but then maybe he does. And so you just have this situation where there just doesn't seem to be a clear path. But at the end of the day, it wasn't Paul's decision to make. At the end of the day, there was one person who had the ability to make that decision. And it seems to be, it doesn't matter who it was, even if I'm wrong about this, there was one person, whether it was the captain or the owner of the boat or Julius, the centurion, one person had the authority to make this decision. And in this instance, he sided with the majority. All right? Now, I'm not saying that they voted and that's why he did it, but it says that the majority of people felt like, no, we shouldn't do this. We should scoot on down the road and try to get 40 miles down the road to Phoenix. Well, let's see how that turns out. When the south wind blew softly, oh, this is going to be a great trip. Starts off great. Cool breeze in your back. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire. So, hopes. So I'm going to send my thoughts with you. You've seen that on Facebook, people when they don't want to use the word prayer, right? So these people are wishing for the best, all right? This is their desire, that they make it these 40 miles down the coastline. That they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. So they're going along here, and they're sailing very, very close. So they're on the south side of the island. They're kind of sticking close to the shore there, and let's see what happens. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called a Euroclydon. Now, that Euroclydon is two Greek words. And the first word means north, and the next word means east. This was the dreaded nor'easter. where the winds are coming from this direction. All right? Normally the favorable winds would have come from the south. All right? So this nor'easter comes up in a tempestuous way. So this was tempest level winds. And that's literally where we get the word tempest from. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. Now what in the world does that mean?
You just had to go and float.
Yeah. There was no trying to, and again, I'm not a sailor, but you don't always go directly with the wind. It's not like your sails here and it's going, you're cutting and, what's the word? What's the word I'm looking for? Tacking, there you go, tacking. So you're tacking back and forth with the wind. This wind was so strong, they were not able to do that. And so they just basically had to let go of the rudder and let this thing be driven wherever the wind wanted it to go, because they were not going to direct this thing where they wanted it to be. So when the ship, verse 15, so when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with great difficulty. So all along this time, there's a skiff or a dinghy, if you will, a large boat that would allow them to get from a small boat that would allow them to get to the shore once they were anchored off an island. This thing's normally pulled behind them. But you can imagine that little vessel with the wind blowing so fiercely, it's going all over everywhere. So they realize if they want to secure this vessel, they've got to get it on board. And so that's what they do here. They get it on board. Verse 17, when they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship or the skiff, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis Islands, they struck sail and so were driven. So up until this point, this boat was being driven by the wind without sails up. And now they're worried that they're going to hit some sandbars or something, and they realize that they've got to be driven even more by the wind, so they raise the sails, and this boat is hightailing it out to sea. Okay? Verse 18, and because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day, now how do they lighten the ship? Okay. Thank God they're not throwing people overboard. All right. But we'll see in a little bit that they were carrying wheat. All right. So this was a common thing from going from this part of the world to that part of the world, carrying large boats full of wheat. All right. And so they start throwing the wheat overboard to lighten the ship so that it would maneuver better. And on the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our hands, with our own hands. What does he mean by the tackle? Yeah, not fishing tackle. Yeah. This was all the things that they needed to steer this boat. The ropes, the gambrels, the hoists, and all those other different things that were necessary. They would have been very heavy implements. And they're throwing these things overboard, and they're basically now completely at the mercy of the wind. There's not much they can do. I think the only thing they have left is a rudder. Okay? Verse 20. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. And there, beloved, is why I believe Luke wrote this down in such detail. He, Paul, and all 276 people on that boat thought they were going to die. That this was the end. And there's simply no way out. That's where they are. Now I might ask you, if you found yourself in a situation like that, and you somehow made it out alive on the other side, wouldn't you want that moment preserved in history? I mean, maybe not for the whole world to know, like we have here, but wouldn't you want your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, for as many generations who might care to know this information, to know how you were delivered from this horrible thing? And I think that's why Luke records this. Verse 21. But after long abstinence from food, now you can only imagine how difficult it would have been to eat on a vessel like this. We went out when we were in Key Largo. We packed sandwiches on this little 4-hour trip that we went on to go deep sea fishing. And it was some rough seas. And let's just suffice it to say, we didn't open the glad bags to eat a sandwich while we were out there for those 4 hours. Because the boat's just going up and down, and I'm just trying to keep everything together over here, hoping we catch a fish. I can only imagine what these guys have been through, even in a much larger vessel, going through a literal hurricane for multiple days, whether it was the difficulty of preparing food, of actually being able to eat it, water and all this sort of stuff. And so they've gone a long amount of time, and we'll learn more about exactly how long that is, but a long amount of time without food or water, and as they're out here. But after long absence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them, and he said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss." I mean, listen, it's just straight from the Lord. If you told somebody and they did it anyway, what should you tell them? I told you so. In all honesty, it might seem like the absolute wrong thing to say here, but it's not, because he doesn't stop there. You see, it's one thing to say, look, you should have listened to me, and so I want you to listen to me now, because I've got some encouraging words and I've got us a way out of this. And it's a completely different thing to say, you should have listened to me, and now here we are. We're all just, you pick your verb that you want to use, the adjective to describe the situation we're in right now. We're up the creek without a paddle. All right, but he doesn't do that. Look what he says. You should have listened to me. He says in verse 22, "And now I urge you to take heart." Now remember, they all think they're dead. They all think this is it. All hope is lost. But apparently something happened the night before Paul says this, and we're going to learn what it is. "And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve." Now that word angel literally means a messenger. Okay? All right? Now I'm not saying it wasn't an angelic figure. All right, but I want you to understand that it was a messenger, and that was the purpose of this angel, to deliver a message from God. All right, saying, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar." This is Nero. "And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you." What in the world does that mean? God has granted to you all those who sail with you. Anybody? Anybody else? Does Paul now have 275 slaves? Do these men now all belong to him? So what does he mean to say that he has granted them to him? Okay. What was Paul apparently doing?
Pray.
There you go. What was he praying for?
Their safety.
For their safety in their lives. So this is the first mention of the Lord in this whole passage, And I'm sure there was a lot going on. I'm not saying that Paul was sitting there silent. It was not his style to remain silent. I'm sure he was talking about the Lord to a lot of people and things like that. But this is one of the key parts of the story, that when all hope was lost, when they all felt themselves as good as dead in the midst of this storm, Paul entreats the Lord, not just on behalf of himself. Not just on behalf of him and Luke and Aristarchus and the handful of other believers, but even these lost pagans, even Julius. Yeah. And he prays for them, and God answers. God answers. Now remember, you're like, I wish God would answer that like that. Yeah, I wish I could experience that too. That sort of clarity. I wish I could experience it too. But you got to remember what I've told you 1,000 times. To whom much is given, much is expected. And Paul is carrying a heavy load, is the one who's pushing and establishing the New Testament church in such a glorious fashion with the help of the Lord, or under the guidance of the Lord. And so he's getting a lot more, but he's doing a lot more. And so the Lord gives him this encouraging word, and he's now sharing it with everyone who's on the boat. And it says there, he says, "Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told to me." He's just told them, no one's going to die, but we're going to lose the ship. Now, no one wants to lose the ship, but if it means no one's going to die, okay, we can handle that. All right? You've all heard or been in a situation, you know, somebody calls you up, their kid's in a car accident, your spouse is in a car accident. Are you okay? And once you hear the, yeah, I'm fine, nothing else matters. Car's totaled, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. You're okay, that's all that matters. And so in this instance, he reveals to them that everyone on this boat is going to live. But, verse 26, however, we must run aground on a certain island. This was a very specific message from the Lord, from this angel. So we've got to run up on this certain island. So now, that's what he said. We don't find it, we don't hear what the response was. I would imagine with 275 other people on the boat, it was a mixed bag. You know, Aristarchus and Luke are saying, oh, man, I'm glad our prayers were answered. I'm glad the Lord revealed this to you, Paul. Thank the Lord for that angel. I imagine that there were some pagans on the other side of the boat, some soldiers who thought this was a bunch of hokum, whatever that word is. Hopefully that's not a cuss word. All right, whatever hokum is. A bunch of mumbo jumbo. It was probably a mixed bag, but look what happens in verse 27. Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea. So they're caught in this tempest for 2 straight weeks. 2 straight weeks in the middle of this hurricane. When the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. Now, I don't know how they sensed it, but they did. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. So they had this way where they could send a sound down and the amount of time that it takes back or something like that. Kind of like using metal cans, strings from treehouse to treehouse, that sort of a thing. We'll just make that up, all right? So they were able to determine that the boat was getting shallower, okay? They were using the Garmin fish finder to do this, is what they were doing. Then, fearing lest we run aground, notice the we there. Remember, Luke's involved in all this. He's right there in the midst of all this. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under the pretense of putting out anchors from the prow. So, you got 276 people. You got rough seas. You got one little skiff. Don't know how many it holds. And these guys have lied, basically, and said, hey, we've got to make sure the anchors are secure, so we're going to go risk our lives by getting down in the boat with these provisions and life jackets and things like that. And Paul, he immediately knew what was going on. And he knew what this prophecy was. He knew what this message from God was. And look what he says. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under the pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion, now remember, it's very obvious the centurion is the one in charge on this boat. He says to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes to the skiff and let it fall off. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. Julius, the centurion, is now listening to Paul. He's received, he didn't listen to him the first time, and they found themselves tempest-tossed in a place where they think they're all going to die. And Paul says, no, we're not going to die. You just got to listen to me, and this is the way it's going to unfold. And so he listens to him, and he believes him. And now he finds himself in a situation where some people are going to do something that would apparently alter the will of God. All right? In other words, this was in some way, this plan was in some way conditional. And I can't wrap my head around that, so don't struggle with that too hard, because he's God and we're just us. But that's what it says. In order for this to unfold like I'm telling you to, these guys can't leave this boat. Now, how he knew that exactly and exactly what the angel said, I don't know. But that's what Paul understood. Now, my question is, did Julius believe that? He believed it to the point that he cut the skiff away from the boat so nobody on that boat had the opportunity to leave. Not a soul. Folks, I don't know what faith is if that's not it. Now, I'm not saying that was faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, but that was faith in the message that Paul had received from this angel of the God that he serves. And Julius apparently believed it to the point where he was willing to risk his own neck. It wasn't something where he said, hey, get that skiff back up here and let's lock it up. No, he wanted to make sure nobody else on that boat had an opportunity to deceitfully try to get away on that skiff or anything else. So he cut the skiff away. Now look what he says. Verse 33. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food. So it's been 2 weeks with no food. Saying, today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food. See, I told you. And you've eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread and he gave thanks to God. Now, can you imagine this? It's hard to wrap your head around the conditions of what this boat must have been. Apparently, if you look at what was said after this, in some fashion they're eating wheat. And I don't know what that looks like. It's possible there was something else there too. I don't know. Maybe I don't have any idea. But I can only imagine the atmosphere and the environment of what this would have looked like, and all these 276 gathered around. And they're listening to Paul. Not Julius the centurion, not the captain, not the owner of the boat. They're listening to Paul, the prisoner, on his way to see Nero. And they're listening to this guy pray and to give thanks for God in the aftermath of this horrible storm that is still going on. But apparently there's a break where he can communicate with them, and he can give thanks to God, and they can eat together. And the idea behind them eating together is that God has got something in store for you, and you need the nourishment in order to carry out your end of it. So let's break this 14-day thing and let's eat. And when he had said these things, he did that. Verse 36, then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, there it is again, Luke's right there. We were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. Now wait a minute. Now I just told you how Julius, the centurion, exercised faith when he cut that skiff away. Look at the faith here. These men had not eaten in 2 weeks. They ate one meal based upon the promise and the encouraging words of this prophet, if you will, by the name of Paul. And they're so convinced that what he said is true that they throw away all their food into the water. They throw away all their food into the water. What faith? Can you wrap your head around that? But that's exactly what they did. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship, if possible. Remember, part of this prophecy was what had to happen to the ship. The ship had to be run aground on some certain island. They didn't say what island, but it had to be a certain island. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. So now they have no way of controlling this vessel, okay? They might be able to steer it a little bit, but they've got no way to stop it, no way to anchor it, no way to slow it down. They let go the anchors and they left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for the shore. So they've got the sail up and they're headed straight for the shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. So the ship has run aground, if you will, but this storm is still going on, and it's battering the backside of the ship, and it's banging against the rocks and all this violence of the waves, and the ship's coming apart. All right? And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners. Now, why would they do this? as Roman soldiers, if you lost a prisoner, that was your life. Okay? And apparently they were so loyal to that decree or that law that even in the midst of these extremely unique circumstances, where even somebody like Nero might be able to understand why you might have lost a few slaves or something like, or a few prisoners. No. They were loyal to a fault, and they were ready to kill these guys. So their soldier the plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, now listen to this, wanting to save Paul. Now that was his job, to get Paul to Nero. And he knew in order to do that, because he believed what Paul had told him, that everyone was going to live, that these guys couldn't die. Just like that boat couldn't, just like certain people couldn't make it ashore. No, that wasn't a part of the plan of God. Also, nobody can die on this boat, whether it be from waves or from a soldier's hand. So the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. So you literally have the swimmers, which would not have been me, by the way, all right? I can tread water, but I'm not going to make it to shore without holding on to something. Other guys are grabbing onto boards that are falling off. Other guys are grabbing onto pieces of the ship, and they're all just, kicking their way to shore, all right? And then it says, and so it was that they all escaped safely to land. They all escaped safely to land. And so Paul's prophecy, that's the end of chapter 27. So Paul's prophecy, or his word from the angel of the Lord, that all would be saved except for the ship and the cargo, was absolutely true. Now, we've just got a few minutes. What do you glean from this? What does this speak to you about your life and the storms that might come? What resonates with you about this?
God is still in control of our lives.
God is still in control. Yep. Anybody else?
My first thought was, God's always in the middle of the storm.
Yeah.
He doesn't leave our side, and He sends us those words of encouragement. He sends us reminders for us to be thankful even when we're going through those difficult times.
Yeah. What else?
Be like Miss Weezer used to say, God brings you to it, He'll take you through it.
Yeah, if He brings you to it, He'll bring you through it. Anybody else? I think there's something else important here, but I want to see if anybody else comes up with it. He's in the details? Yeah. There were certain things that He wanted to happen in just a certain way. I mean, because if it had happened where, a couple of those guys swam away, and it didn't happen according to God's plan, then God might have, this sounds terrible, but God wouldn't have gotten the credit for it.
If they had done what Paul said in the very beginning,
Yeah.
everything would have been saved, supposedly.
This is perhaps, but the one thing I would say about that, though, is they would have given the credit to Paul.
To Paul.
Because he didn't give a word from the Lord there. This was his perception.
Yeah.
I think this isn't going to be a good day on the water, guys.
Well, in the end, it reflects on that.
Huh?
It still won them in the 3 weeks it took to get there.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if they would have waited one day, they said, well, we still got to go. So they'd have still gone out there.
Yeah.
But in the end, they were all saved, and that's what God's plan is, that all men are saved.
Yeah. Here's the thing that jumps out about me, just for the sake of time, because I want us to have time to pray. Somebody could ask, like when Paul gave his first testimony about what the angel of the Lord said to him, or the messenger of God said to him. And there might have been a skeptic on that boat who said, well, listen, if your God is so powerful, why is He letting this happen? And so we have to ask ourselves, why did God let them go through the storm to begin with? What was it? Couldn't God have just given them smooth sailing? Couldn't He have given them a non-stop from Caesarea all the way over here with a nice, easterly wind that would just carry him straight there? Couldn't he? Of course he could have done that. God wouldn't have gotten the glory. And what else, though?
He wouldn't been as real to him, that's for sure.
There you go. Okay. You see, to me, this goes to that core question that so many of your non-believing, and maybe even so many of you might struggle with. Why do bad things have to happen? Why is it in God's economy, in this world that we live in, why is it that bad things happen? Whether it be good people or bad people or the whole mix, why is that? And to me, what I see in all this is that, listen, if life was just a bed of roses for everybody, if it was a place where nothing bad ever happened, nobody ever got sick, nobody ever died, nothing ever went wrong, no one ever got jilted or whatever it was, then let's just imagine it was almost like a garden, called Eden. Would people realize their need for the Lord? If you've never been at the end of your rope, like Paul and Luke and those 276 sailors and soldiers, the people on that boat were, where they felt all hope was lost, if you don't ever recognize the need for something good and holy and powerful, then why would you ever realize your need for God? Somebody who never has any bumps in the road, any trials or struggles or needs or anything like that, why would they seek out the God of the universe? And I think that that's part of the reason, not just for the glory, but Acts, earlier in Acts, when Paul was speaking to the folks at the Areopagus, he talked about how God put each person in their respective places, in their respective times. And why did he do that? Do you remember? Anybody? That they might seek him and grope for him, that they might ultimately find him. And so in the midst of the storm and the darkness and this horrific need, put him in a place where somebody had the answer, and that answer came from the Most High God, who proved himself to be true and accurate. And I wish we had a better account. I wish that there was a baptism and they all hit the shore, and all 273. We already know that Aristarchus and Luke and some of the others are believers, but that would have been a great thing to hear. But we just don't get that account here for whatever reason. Maybe Luke will give us some more details in Acts chapter 28. But I think that should encourage you that God's got a reason for allowing these storms to occur in our life. And it might be so that the non-believer will be stirred to such a way that they might seek deliverance from this storm, whether it be a literal storm or something else. But also that they might see your response to the storm and how you deal with it. And if you go back and read this again, I think you'll come to the conclusion, like me, that before Paul's message from the angel, Luke doesn't say that everybody but me, Paul, and Aristarchus lost hope. They all had lost hope. I think there was a time where Paul and Luke felt like this was the end of the journey. This was it. Wasn't how I thought it was going to go, Lord, but I think that's what they thought. But ultimately, from that encouraging word from the angel of the Lord, Paul had an opportunity to demonstrate that genuine faith. And you have that, but you wouldn't have that opportunity if God didn't allow you to go through certain storms, like cancer, or the loss of a loved one, loss of a spouse, whether it be through death or divorce or whatever it might be. If God didn't allow those certain things to come up in your life so that you could demonstrate to the lost world around you what faith looks like in God, they would never have a chance to see it. That makes sense? Anybody have any questions? Anybody need a small broom handle?
Miss Cindy.
It's for short people. All right, let me pray for us. Father, in the same way that Paul, he broke that bread and he gave thanks to God. And I don't think he was thanking you just for the bread. And so, Lord, I just want to thank you for the storms in my life. And I can't do that for everybody else in this room, but maybe they'd want to utter that prayer on their own right now. I thank you for the storms in my life and the way you have revealed yourself to me and your power to me. Whether those storms were for my good or for my correction or whatever it was, I thank you for them now. And pray that I would learn from those storms, that I wouldn't have to repeat that class, so to speak. But Lord, if those need to come, that others might be able to see me demonstrate genuine faith in who you are and your power and your goodness and your salvation, I welcome them. And Lord, I thank you for the example of Paul and of Luke. And even knowing that as humans, we will find times in our life where the storm seems too much to bear. And we might, our hope might fail. I thank you for your restorative power, your patience and your grace in our life. And I just thank you for it all in Jesus' name. Amen.